Hello everyone, welcome to Indian Economy by Aman Soni. In today's news hour, we shall be discussing the important articles related to economy from the Hindu newspaper. In the open editorial page, there is an article about the coal crisis. Let's go through it. The article holistically discusses about the what are the reasons for the current coal shortage and what is the impact of the coal energy prices at the international market on the domestic economy and what are the issues that is plaguing the discoms and why are the state governments not ready to import coal and use them in the coal production unit. This article could be very important for the upcoming mains examination. There could be a possible question on this topic. We have been seeing coal crisis from the last few months, and on June 10th, the India's power demand increased to a record high of almost 211 megawatts because there is a coal shortage on the one hand on the supply side, because of which the electricity generation is low. On the other hand, because of the increased demand due to the recovery of the economy, the manufacturing processes improved, the production improved, so the demand for electricity improved. At the same time, because of the summer heat, even the domestic consumption of electricity increased. So because of the supply side factors and the demand side factors, the demand for coal increased and there is a supply demand because of which there is a shortage. And the data says that the coal stocks available with the some of the coal producing companies are only enough for coming 8 days. And at this juncture, to increase the supply, the government came up with a notification, and the notification was that the companies had to use 10% of imported coal in the power generation. So what would be the impact of this notification and what is the problem with the current demand? Let's go through it. India is the second largest producer of coal, and the reserves that we have could sustain us for another 100 years. But there is a problem here. The quality of coal that is available in India is low. It has high ash content. So the energy that we get out of the coal is very low. So we had to import coal for power generation and for other uses and for coking purposes. At the same time, the domestic production of coal stagnated between the financial year 18 and 22. Here let's look at this graph. Here we can see that the domestic coal production kept increasing, but it stagnated during 18 and 19 financial years. But at the same time, the demand kept increasing, and because of COVID, both the demand and the production both reduced. And because of the fall in domestic demand, the supply got affected. At the same time, owing to the economic recovery and the increasing hot weather, the industrial demand and the domestic demand for electricity increased. So one side we are seeing that the production has fallen and the demand has increased. So what would happen in such a situation? When there is less supply and more demand, the price would obviously increase. So the domestic coal supplies are not enough to meet the current demand of the electricity and the coal generation in India. At the same time, what happened? The quality of imported coal, the quantity of coal that we are importing and using for electricity generation, that also reduced over the years. Here you can see the amount of totally import dependent coal generation plants and even the domestic using coal plants which are using imported coal, the percentage of which kept reducing. By 2022 it almost reduced to 18% and 8%. So here we can contrast and see, on one side the domestic production is reducing, the demand is increasing, at the same time the quantity of imports is reducing. And what are the reasons for reduction in the quantity of imports? The reason is increasing high prices of coal in the international market. Because of high prices in the international market of coal, we reduce the imports. Now the government came up with a notification saying that you have to import 10% of imported coal and use it in production. The power generation companies would not do this because even if they do it, they would incur heavy losses because the price has risen very steeply. And if they incur at a high cost, the manufacturing cost would increase and the cost of the end consumer would also increase. At the same time, the discount companies, the distribution companies, they are not passing on the cost to the customers because of the politics, because of the vote bank politics, because of the decisions of the various state governments. They are incurring losses and they are not passing on the prices to the customers, because of which the discount companies are also suffering losses. So here you can see that the amount of losses that discount companies in various states are incurring. Tamil Nadu and Rajasthan being the highest, and here it is a differential between the cost and the price which is given to the consumer. So this is a loss of almost 2 rupees per kilowatt the discount companies incur. And at the same time, the discount companies, because they are in losses, they are not paying the dues to the power generating companies, the coal power generating companies, and the working capital of these companies, the power generating companies, is getting struck because the discount companies are not paying them timely dues. Even the state governments are delaying the dues to the generating companies, so the financial health of the generating companies will also get affected. So this is about the crisis in the coal sector. To sum up, on one hand, there is fall in domestic production in 2018 and 19. There is increase in demand because of recovery of economy and the increase in domestic consumption because of the summer heat wave, etc. At the same time, the amount of imported quantity of imported coal that reduced over the years, and the imported coal prices are steeply high in the national market. Adding to all this, the discount companies are incurring losses and they are not making timely payments for power generating companies. So everything is messed up. It would take some time for the coal sector to recover. And what would be the impact on the end consumer? So probably we will see power cuts in the rural areas and tier 2 cities, because the companies would want to go for load shedding, and this would directly again have an impact on the power generation, manufacturing and the economy overall. Let's go further. In the text and context, this article discusses about the crisis that is going on in the Pakistan economy. On one side, the value of the Pakistan rupee, it is falling and the foreign exchange reserves are getting depleted. There is energy shortage. On the other side, there are fuel prices which are increasing. And at this juncture, will the IMF help Pakistan? The Pakistan rupee has been falling continuously from last 2-3 years, and the foreign exchange reserves are also getting depleted because they have been continuously importing and the exports are lesser than the imports. So foreign exchange reserves have been decreasing. At the same time, because of the global inflation increase in the crude oil prices, the fuel prices also kept continuously increasing. This had compounding effects on the increase of oil and electricity prices, so they also kept increasing. So at this juncture, will the IMF bail out Pakistan? If the IMF have to give money to Pakistan, it will put some conditions. It would want Pakistan to reduce the amount of subsidies. It would want Pakistan to reduce the inflation, take measures to reduce the inflation in the domestic economy, and to reduce the fiscal and current account deficit. But will Pakistan do that? Because in the coming year there would be elections, and what if Pakistan borrows money from IMF and pays it to China under the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor? And the IMF would also want Pakistan to reduce the amount of subsidies that it is giving to the energy sector, especially for fuel oil and electricity. And Pakistan is not in a position to reduce the subsidies because of vote bank politics and for appeasement. And at the same time, Pakistan also created a special security division to protect the assets of China, which it is constructing under the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So this is also increasing the cost on the exchequer. And we all know Pakistan is placed under the grey list of FATF. So because of which the amount of finances that it gets is limited. At the same time, Pakistan mostly borrows from Saudi Arabia and China. These both countries don't care if Pakistan is in grey list or blacklist. They have been extending support for Pakistan. In May 22, Saudi Arabian government, they promised a support of almost $8 billion to Pakistan. And in December 2021, when Imran Khan was the head, he secured almost a $3 billion support to Pakistan. And we'll have to wait and see if China supports Pakistan or if IMF gives money to Pakistan, and what if Pakistan pays that money to China instead of using that money to recover its economy. And will Pakistan go like the Sri Lankan way? We have been seeing about the crisis in Sri Lanka and how it impacted the political economy. The difference there and between Sri Lanka and Pakistan is, in Sri Lanka, the economic crisis, it converted into a political crisis. But in the Pakistan, there is a coalition government now, so it is very unlikely that it would turn into a political crisis. So we'll just have to wait and see how Pakistan would come out of this situation. Open network for digital commerce. The government had mooted this concept for open network for digital commerce. This idea is just like the UPI. In UPI earlier, what would happen? Before UPI, if Paytm is there, a person using Paytm had to scan the QR code only of Paytm and he had to make payment. Even the receiver had to be on Paytm. If the user is from PhonePe, then he had to make receipts only to the PhonePe user. There was no interoperability between both of the two. Then government got UPI interoperability norms, and because of which even a Paytm user can now scan a universal QR code and he can make payment to a Paytm receiver or Google Pay receiver or any other. So now there is interoperability in the UPI regime. The same concept has to be emulated in the digital commerce, because now in the digital commerce, the number of retailers are very limited. The power of the retailers especially is very limited because it is dominated by Amazon and Walmart, which has invested in the Flipkart. So to democratize the e-com sector, the government is coming up with a concept of open network for digital commerce. This ONDC works just like the interoperability in the UPI, wherein a seller registered under a particular website, say for example Amazon, the buyer need not go to the website of Amazon. He could purchase from any other website. For example, all the sellers would be integrated, whether the seller is registered on the Amazon or the Flipkart, it all would be integrated and the buyer could purchase from any of these sellers. So how would this impact the retailer? In India, compared to the physical retail trade, the online e-commerce is just 4.3%. So there is a huge untapped potential, because of which the government is coming up with ONDC, and it would give more access and democratize the digital space, especially for the small retail sellers, because now they can register themselves on ONDC, and when they are given access to this ONDC platform, the seller can purchase from the consumer can purchase from sellers registered on any of the website. So currently it is still in discussion stage, and it would be started in pilot stage in few of the cities like Delhi, Bengaluru, Bhopal, Shillong and Coimbatore. So we'll have to wait and see how the practical aspect of it would be when it is finally implemented. And there are certain positives and negatives of this ONDC. The positive aspect being the standardization of operations. For example, now if a particular seller is selling on Amazon and Flipkart, he has to make a separate listing in Amazon, separate listing in Flipkart, the cataloging, the inventory management for Amazon, and the separate management for Flipkart. Now if he is listed on ONDC, all this would be standardized and integrated. The order management, the order fulfillment, everything would be integrated. So this becomes simpler and easier for the especially small business. At the same time, there are certain issues. What if enough number of e-commerce platforms don't sign up for this ONDC? For example, when the interoperability in the UPI regime took place, what if Paytm, PhonePe, they all didn't want to come into the interoperability and they all wanted to remain separate? We would still be using Paytm QR code to pay to the Paytm user, PhonePe QR code to pay to the PhonePe user. Now because there is universal QR code, we can use Paytm or PhonePe to pay to any other user or receiver. So the issue is, what if enough number of digital commerce companies, they don't sign up on ONDC? And the other aspect is, who would take care of the customer service? And what about the payment integration? So all those practical aspects have to be taken care of. And because the concept is still not practically implemented, we would know it once it is implemented. We'll have to wait for that. In the business page, government is said to aim to keep its deficit at 6.7%. In yesterday's news hour, we discussed about how the current account deficit is increasing, inflation is increasing, and how RBI is planning to increase the repo rate to control the money supply from the demand side, because the supply chain and the supply side impacts would take longer for taking effect as compared to the demand side. Now the government is aiming to keep its deficit at 6.7%. Otherwise, it would lead to fiscal slippage. What is fiscal slippage? When the government's fiscal deficit exceeds its target, that is, the fiscal target is slipping. So that is why the name fiscal slippage. If that happens, if the deficit increases even more, it would directly impact the sovereign rating of the government. So if the Indian government want to borrow funds from the international market, if the sovereign ratings of the government comes down, then the borrowing cost would increase for the government. So that would again have an impact on the debt. And the debt to GDP of the government is already very high. And if it further increases, it would again affect the sovereign rating of the government. And because the government is planning to reduce deficit, it cannot spend on other aspects. For example, it has to reduce on subsidies and other freebies that it is giving to the people. And if the government goes for additional market borrowing, it would increase the yields in the market, and it would eventually lead to higher inflation, because the government borrowing from the market would finally mean that the government is spending the money somewhere. Then the money supply in the market would increase in the long term. So the increase in the money supply will lead to increase in inflation. So what we are planning to reduce now, that is the inflation and the deficit. If the government borrows, finally it would lead to more inflation in the future. So the government has to take care of it. RBI moots IT sourcing norms for banks and NBFCs. This is not important for UPSC, it is technical in nature. Here just the headlines is important. Artificial intelligence can add almost $500 billion to GDP by 2025 if we are using the artificial intelligence and integrating them into the businesses through automation, big data analytics, etc. These are the articles related to economy today. Thank you so much.